Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we are taking a look at some pretty specific laws from the Philippines. They're special penal laws.
Yeah, these are interesting. It's not just the usual crimes. These laws single out some very specific offenses, things that are particularly relevant to the Philippines.
So not your everyday parking ticket or jaywalking violation, right?
Yeah, definitely not.
Yeah.
We're talking arson, cybercrime, human trafficking,
Yeah.
even cattle rustling.
Cattle rustling. Seriously. Okay, I'm intrigued. But before we get to those, maybe you could give us a quick overview of what makes these special penal laws so unique.
Well, they're different from the general criminal code. Like their revised penal code covers the basics. But these special penal laws, they zoom in on very specific issues. Think of them as like legal spotlights on certain crimes. Each one has its own unique elements and considerations that set it apart.
Okay, so it's like they're saying, hey, these crimes are a big deal here, so we're giving them extra attention. Makes sense. So our mission today is to unpack these key provisions, figure out what makes them tick, uncover any surprising details, and maybe even throw in some real-world examples to bring it all to life. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's start with something that's pretty relevant in the Philippines and maybe a little unexpected: loose firearms.
Loose firearms. Okay, I'm already picturing a Wild West saloon, but seriously, what exactly are we talking about here?
So in the Philippines, loose firearms are divided into 8 categories.
Yeah.
Basically, any firearm that's not properly registered or is in the wrong hands.
8 categories. Wow, like what kind of stuff are we talking about?
Think unregistered firearms, those with tampered serial numbers, firearms that are illegally made, stolen firearms, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, that covers a lot of ground. So what happens if someone gets caught with one of these loose firearms? Is it always a separate crime?
That's where it gets interesting. Sometimes possessing a loose firearm, i.e. the crime itself. But other times it gets absorbed into a larger offense.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. Say someone uses a loose firearm during a rebellion or an insurrection. In that case, the firearm possession becomes part of that bigger crime.
So it's like a bonus charge if you're already in trouble for something bigger.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Even if they don't actually use the loose firearm during a crime, just having it on them can lead to a harsher sentence.
Wait, so just possessing a loose firearm can make things worse, even if it stayed hidden? That seems pretty strict.
It is. They take it very seriously.
Yeah.
There's actually a case, People v. De Leon, that illustrates this point. Basically, if a group commits a crime, like robbery, using an unlicensed firearm, even typical mitigating factors won't reduce their sentence.
Wow, that's really eye-opening. Okay, moving on from firearms, what about explosives? Does Philippine law have anything specific to say about those?
Absolutely. Just like with loose firearms, there's a specific provision for using explosives in crimes. It's considered an aggravating circumstance, meaning it can make the punishment much harsher, especially if someone dies as a result.
That makes sense. So are we talking just bombs here?
Not necessarily.
Right.
Think Molotov cocktails.
Molotov cocktails, seriously. I always think of those as like protest tools or something.
Oh, they're incredibly dangerous and can cause a lot of damage.
Mm.
And in the eyes of the law, they fall under this explosives provision.
Okay, firearms, explosives. We're covering some pretty intense stuff here. Let's get even more specific. What about the crime of illegal possession of firearms? What do they need to prove to actually convict someone?
Well, to nail down a conviction for illegal possession of firearms, the prosecution has to prove 2 things. First, they have to prove the firearm even exists.
Okay, that seems pretty basic, but how can you convict someone if they don't actually find the gun?
Good question. That's where things get interesting. The prosecution can use other evidence, like witness testimony, to prove the firearm's existence. There's actually a case, People v. Canas, where the firearm was never recovered, but other evidence was strong enough to secure a conviction.
So it's like a legal puzzle where they piece together the proof. Okay, so what's the second thing they need to prove?
They have to demonstrate that the person caught with a firearm didn't have a license for it. That's the illegal part of the equation.
Makes sense. It's not just about owning a gun, it's about owning it legally. Okay, this is all getting pretty heavy. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about something really important: laws that focus on protecting children.
Absolutely. The Philippines has a law specifically for the Anti-OSAEC and CSAEM Act. It tackles online and offline child sexual abuse and exploitation, which are huge problems.
Whoa, those are some mouthful acronyms. Break those down for us. What exactly do they mean?
Okay, so OSAEC stands for Online Sexual Abuse or Exploitation of Children, and CAEM stands for Child Sexual Abuse or Exploitation Material. We're talking about photos, videos, audio recordings, written content, anything that depicts a child in a sexual way.
So even if it's not a video of actual abuse, it could still be considered CSAEM.
Right. The law is very broad here. It includes anything that focuses on a child's private parts, even if it doesn't show any explicit sexual activity. They're trying to protect kids from any form of sexualization.
That's good to know. It's like they're saying hands off no matter what. So this law applies to things like child pornography, obviously, but what about other forms of online abuse?
Oh, yeah. The law also tackles things like online grooming, where someone builds a relationship with a child online to gain their trust and then exploit them. And then there's live streaming of abuse, which is truly horrific. It's basically real-time abuse happening online.
That's awful. It's like technology is giving these predators new ways to harm kids. So this law covers a wide range of online offenses, but what about the issue of consent? Like, what if a child says they're okay with something?
The law makes it clear that even if a child seems to consent, it doesn't matter. They're considered too young to fully understand the implications of their actions.
So it's like saying, we know kids can be manipulated or pressured into things, so we're not going to let that be a defense.
Exactly. And they've also been proactive about addressing the evolving ways technology can be used for exploitation. Image-based sexual abuse is a key part of this law.
Image-based. Is that like revenge porn where someone shares explicit pictures without consent?
Yes, it includes that. But it also covers things like sextortion, where someone threatens to release private images unless they're paid. And then there's the whole issue of deepfakes.
Deepfakes. I've heard about those, but I don't fully understand them.
Well, deepfakes use AI to create videos of people doing things they never actually did. And sometimes those videos are sexual in nature. It's pretty scary stuff.
Yeah, it's like technology is creating entirely new ways to exploit people. So this Anti-OSAEC and CSAEM Act, it sounds pretty comprehensive.
It is. The list of unlawful acts under this law is extensive. They're trying to cover every angle.
So it's not just the people directly creating or sharing this material, it's also those who help them in any way.
Right. It's about disrupting the entire network involved in child exploitation. Anyone who provides locations for abuse, profits from it, or even possesses CSAEM is in trouble.
Wow, they're really cracking down. And to reinforce what we talked about consent, does the law say anything about that?
It specifically states that the victim's consent is not a defense when prosecuting these crimes. No matter what, they're on the side of protecting kids.
That's good to hear. Now, are there any protections for people who might come across this material online and want to report it? Like, what if someone stumbles upon a website that looks suspicious?
That's where the Good Samaritan Clause comes in. It protects those who report cases or try to remove CSAEM online.
That's encouraging, but are there any conditions?
Of course. They have to be acting in good faith, meaning their intention is to prevent harm. And they have to report the incident to authorities within 24 hours of taking any action.
So, no vigilante justice. Okay, that makes sense. This is all really heavy stuff. Maybe we can move on to something a little less emotionally charged. What about a crime like fencing? I always hear that term in movies.
Fencing in this context has nothing to do with swords or Olympic sports. It's about dealing in stolen goods, but with the added intention of making a profit.
Ah, so we're talking about those shady backroom deals where stolen goods get sold off.
You got it. And here's where it gets interesting. In the Philippines, if you're caught possessing stolen goods, you're automatically presumed to be a fence unless you can prove otherwise.
Wow, that's a tough spot to be in. How do you even begin to prove you had no idea something was stolen?
The best way is with good record keeping. If you have a clearance or a permit to sell used goods, like in a pawn shop, then that presumption of fencing doesn't apply.
So it's like they're saying, if you're in the business of buying and selling used stuff, you better have your paperwork in order.
Exactly. And even failing to get the required permits can get you in trouble.
They're not messing around. It's like they're trying to shut down the entire market for stolen goods.
Absolutely. It's about cutting off the demand to discourage theft in the first place. Okay, we've talked about stolen Rolexes and shady deals, but let's go a bit more rural. What about cattle rustling?
Cattle rustling? Seriously, I thought that was just something you see in old Western movies.
Believe it or not, cattle rustling is still a real problem in some parts of the Philippines. They even have a specific law against it, the anti-cattle rustling law.
No way. So we are talking about actual livestock theft here.
Yep. Taking cattle without the owner's consent, and that includes stealing the meat or hying. It's about protecting the farmer's livelihood.
Okay, I'm guessing we're not just talking about cows here.
Nope.
Yeah.
The law is very specific about what falls under large cattle. We're talking cows, carabaos, horses, mules, even donkeys.
Donkeys? Really?
Yep. If someone makes off with your prize-winning donkey, you can bet the anti-cattle rustling law will come into play. And there's an interesting presumption built into the law. If you're caught with large cattle and can't show any documentation proving you own them or got them legally.
Let me guess they assume you rustled them.
Exactly. No bill of sale, big trouble. They're making it harder for cattle rustlers to get away with their crimes. Okay, we've covered some pretty unique crimes so far. Let's switch gears again and talk about laws that are supposed to keep public officials honest.
Yeah, that's a big one. Corruption is a problem in many countries, so how does the Philippines tackle this?
Well, they have a law called the Anti-GRAFT and Corrupt Practices Act. This law casts a wide net. It doesn't just cover public officials themselves. It also covers their relatives up to the third degree.
Wait, they're relatives too? That's pretty intense.
It is. It's about preventing conflicts of interest and making sure public officials aren't using their power to enrich themselves or their families.
So, no giving your nephew a cushy government contract, then. Are there any other specific things they're not allowed to do under this law?
Tons. For example, they can't use their position to cause harm to someone or give them unfair advantages just because they like or dislike them. No playing favorites or punishing enemies.
So, no personal vendettas. But what if it's an honest mistake? Like, what if a public official makes a decision that turns out to be bad, but they genuinely thought it was the right thing to do?
That's where good faith comes in. If a public official can prove they were acting in good faith, meaning they genuinely believed they were doing the right thing, the punishment might not be as severe.
So, unintentional slip-ups might get a pass, but deliberate corruption won't fly. Makes sense. Now, is there anything in Philippine law that goes beyond just avoiding criminal acts? Like, do they have any ethical guidelines for public officials?
Definitely. They have a code of conduct and ethical standards for public officials and employees. It tackles things like gifts and conflicts of interest.
I'm curious about that. What actually counts as a gift for a public official?
Basically anything of value given for free. But small, unsolicited tokens like souvenirs are usually okay, as long as there's no expectation of a favor in return. The big no-no is having any financial interest in any transaction that requires their approval.
So if a public official is in charge of awarding contracts, they can't own stock in any of the companies bidding on those contracts.
Exactly. That's a clear conflict of interest. And there are other rules, too. They can't work other jobs in regulated industries, reveal confidential information they learn on the job, or even solicit gifts from people.
So no dropping hints about that birthday present. They're really trying to maintain a high standard for ethical behavior. Speaking of ethical behavior, what about laws around hazing? That's a huge issue, especially in schools and universities.
You're right, and the Philippines takes it very seriously. Their Anti-Hazing Act defines hazing much more broadly than you might think.
Really? So it's not just about physical abuse?
Well, it covers that, of course. But it also includes any act that causes psychological suffering as part of an initiation ritual. Think humiliation, mental torment, or even forcing someone to do pointless tasks.
So it's about acknowledging that mental and emotional abuse can be just as damaging as physical abuse.
Exactly. And here's the important part. Hazing is completely banned in schools and workplaces. No exceptions.
Wow, they're serious about this. Are there any situations where hazing is allowed?
There's one exception, military and police training.
Oh, so all those grueling drills they put recruits through, that's technically hazing, but it's okay because it's part of the training.
Right. The argument is that those professions demand a very specific type of training that pushes people to their physical and mental limits. But outside of those very specific situations, hazing is a no-go.
I can see why they make that exception, but it's definitely a tricky line to walk. Now, what about people who might be present during hazing but don't actually participate? Are they off the hook?
Not necessarily. The law introduces the concept of prima facie evidence of participation. Basically, if you're there, you're presumed to be involved unless you can prove you actively tried to stop it or report it to the authorities.
So even just standing by and watching could get you in trouble. It's like the law is saying, if you see something, do something.
Exactly. It's about encouraging people to be active bystanders, not passive observers.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's talk about a law that's incredibly relevant in today's world, the Anti-Photo and Video Voyeurism Act.
This law is all about protecting your privacy. It makes it illegal to record someone engaged in a sexual act or to capture images of their private areas without their consent, especially in places where they have a reasonable expectation of privacy.
So no more hiding cameras in bathrooms or bedrooms. But what exactly does it mean to have a reasonable expectation of privacy?
Basically, it means a reasonable person would believe they were in a space where they could undress or be intimate without being recorded.
So your home, a locker room, a public restroom, those would all fall under that definition.
Exactly. And the law doesn't just cover the act of recording. It also makes it illegal to copy, sell, distribute, or even broadcast these images without consent.
It's like they are trying to stop the spread of these images at every step.
They are. They're trying to protect victims and prevent these images from being used for harassment or exploitation.
Okay, from hidden cameras to high-level corruption, let's talk about a crime that sounds like something out of a movie, plunder.
Plunder in the Philippines is serious business. We're talking about public officials who accumulate at least 50 million pesos in ill-gotten wealth.
50 million pesos, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So we are talking about corrupt politicians and their shady dealing.
Exactly. The law is very specific about what qualifies as plunder. It's not just about accepting a few bribes. It's about systematic corruption for personal enrichment.
Okay, so to be charged with plunder, you have to be a pretty high-level criminal.
You got it. And there's this concept called the wheel and chain conspiracy that helps explain how plunder works. It shows how multiple people can be involved, each playing a different role in the scheme.
So even if you're not the mastermind, you can still be held accountable if you help move the money or cover up the crimes.
That's right. It acknowledges that these schemes often involve a whole network of people working together. Okay, this is getting intense. Let's move on to something truly horrific. Torture. How does Philippine law define this? They have a law called the Anti-Torture Act of 2009, and it's very clear. Torture is any act that intentionally inflicts severe physical or mental pain or suffering for a specific purpose.
Okay, so we are talking about things like physical beatings and psychological torment.
Absolutely, and the purpose behind the act is important. The law says torture can be used to extract information, punish someone, intimidate them, or even discriminate against them.
So even if there aren't any visible injuries, if the actions were meant to terrorize or break someone, it can still be considered torture.
Yes, exactly. And the law provides a long list of specific acts that are considered torture. Some of them are pretty disturbing.
I'm a little hesitant to hear those, but I know it's important to understand the full scope of this law.
Well, it includes things like beatings, burning with cigarettes, electric shocks, even waterboarding. And it's not just physical. Psychological torture includes things like threats, solitary confinement, and prolonged interrogation without sleep.
It's chilling to think those things happen, but I'm glad the Philippines has a law that specifically addresses this horrible crime.
Absolutely. Now, from torture to a crime that often involves immense cruelty and exploitation, human trafficking. The Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act in the Philippines targets various unlawful acts, and some of them might surprise you.
Okay, give me some examples. What kind of things fall under human trafficking?
Well, it obviously includes forcing people into labor or sexual exploitation, but it goes way beyond that. It covers arranging sham marriages, where someone is basically bought and sold as a spouse, recruiting people for organ harvesting, even exploiting someone for forced begging or criminal activities.
Wow. It's amazing how many different forms trafficking can take. It's good to know the law addresses these less obvious types of exploitation.
They are trying to be as comprehensive as possible. And they have a concept called qualified trafficking, which carries harsher penalties.
What makes trafficking qualified?
Things like if the victim is a child, if it's a large-scale operation, or if the trafficker is someone in a position of authority.
So they're taking into account the vulnerability of the victims and the level of power involved. This is all very sobering. Okay, what else should we cover before we move on?
Let's talk about a law that addresses a very real and pervasive problem: violence against women and children. The Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children Act in the Philippines takes a pretty broad approach.
That's a crucial issue. What exactly does this law consider violence?
Well, first, it's very specific about the relationships it covers. We're talking about wives, former wives, women someone has or had a dating or sexual relationship with, and even women with whom they have a child.
So it's about protecting women from violence within intimate relationships.
Exactly. And the law goes beyond just physical violence. It also covers sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and even economic abuse.
Economic abuse. What does that mean?
It can involve things like controlling someone's finances, withholding support, or even preventing them from working or taking away their property. It's all about power and control.
That makes sense. So it's about recognizing that abuse can take many forms. Now, I'm assuming this law is directed at men as the abusers.
Actually, that's where it gets interesting. The law itself might seem that way, but court decisions have clarified that it's actually gender neutral.
So a woman could be found guilty of abusing her husband under this law.
Absolutely. It's not about gender, it's about the actions and the relationship. The key case here is Knutson v. Sybil Knutson. This case also made it clear that both mothers and fathers have equal rights to seek protection orders.
So fathers have equal standing under the law. That's a big step in the right direction. It's about recognizing the rights of both parents. Okay, we've covered some heavy topics. Let's switch gears to something that might hit a little closer to home for some people, the bouncing checks law.
Ah, yes. BATAS PAMBANSA BILANG 22. Bouncing checks can be a major hassle, and this law takes them seriously. It specifically deals with those formal checks you use for business transactions, not those personal checks you might use for everyday purchases.
Okay, so if I write a check for groceries and it bounces, am I in big trouble?
Probably not. This law mainly focuses on two situations. First, if someone knowingly issues a check without enough money in their account to cover it, that's intentional deception, and that's a crime.
So it's about those who are deliberately trying to scam people with bad checks.
Right. The second situation is when someone has enough money in their account when they write the check, but then they don't keep enough money in the account, and the check bounces within 90 days.
So even if it wasn't intentional, you could still be in trouble for mismanaging your account.
Exactly. It's about being responsible with your finances and making sure you can cover the checks you write.
Okay, that seems fair. Are there any other interesting details about this law that people should know?
One peculiar thing is stolen checks. They actually don't fall under this law.
Wait, really? Why not?
Because they lack something called valuable consideration. Essentially, there was no real exchange of goods or services behind those checks.
So if someone steals my checkbook and writes a bad check to themselves, they might get in trouble for theft, but not for violating the bouncing checks law.
Exactly. Another crucial thing is this idea of written notice of dishonor.
Written notice of dishonor.
Yeah, it means the person who got the bounce check has to formally notify the check writer in writing that their check was dishonored. And this is where it gets interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
That written notice triggers a 5-day grace period. During those 5 days, the check writer can pay the full amount, or at least make arrangements to pay, before it becomes a criminal matter.
Oh, so it's like a second chance to make things right.
You got it. And there are actually some court cases that emphasize just how important this written notice is.
Like what?
Well, in the DECO VCA case, a conviction was overturned because the prosecution couldn't prove the check writer got that proper written notice. And Rusterio v. FIREARMS really highlighted that the notice has to be received within 90 days for the presumption of knowledge of insufficient funds to kick in.
So it's not just about sending a notice, it's about proving it was received and on time. That sounds complicated.
It can be. This is why it's so important to handle bounce checks carefully, both for the person who receives the check and the one who wrote it. Okay, from financial headaches to a topic that's been in the headlines a lot, let's talk about the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act, also known as RA 9165.
This one has definitely generated some controversy. So what's the deal with this law?
This law covers pretty much everything related to dangerous drugs. Importation, manufacture, sale, possession, you name it. It's their way of tackling the drug problem head-on.
Okay, so it's a really broad approach. What are some specific things people can get in trouble for under this law?
Well, importing, selling, trading, transporting, making drugs, those are the big ones. But it goes further. Maintaining a drug den, using drugs, even growing plants that are classified as dangerous drugs, it's all illegal.
So they're not just going after the kingpins, they're also targeting users and small-time dealers.
Exactly. It's about disrupting the entire drug trade from top to bottom. And this is where some of the controversy comes in, particularly with something called the chain of custody rule.
Chain of custody, what's that all about?
Basically, it means meticulously documenting how drug evidence is handled from the moment it's seized to when it's presented in court, like a paper trail that proves it wasn't tampered with or planted.
So every single step has to be accounted for.
Pretty much. And if there's a break in that chain of custody, the case can be dismissed, even if they have other evidence. The courts are strict about this.
Wow. So even a small mistake in handling the evidence could let someone off the hook.
It's happened. There was a case, Jukinchivi people, where the Supreme Court actually acquitted the accused because of problems with the chain of custody. But the good news is the courts also acknowledge that sometimes little slip-ups happen, especially if they're justified and don't actually affect the evidence.
So it's not about being absolutely perfect, but it's about being careful and responsible.
Right. It's a balance between making sure the process is fair and ensuring those involved in the drug trade are held accountable.
Okay, so chain of custody is all about making sure the evidence is legit. What about actually proving that the substance is a drug?
That's another key concept called corpus delicti.
Corpus delicti.
Uh,
Sounds serious.
it means body of the crime. Basically, you have to prove the substance seized is actually a prohibited drug. You can't just say, we found a baggie of white powder, so it must be illegal.
They have to actually test it and prove it's cocaine or heroin or whatever drug is in question.
You got it. Scientific evidence is key here.
It's interesting how much weight the law puts on scientific proof.
It's about making sure they get the right people for the right reasons. Okay, from the physical world to the digital one, let's talk about cybercrime. The Cybercrime Prevention Act of 2012 is all about tackling those online offenses.
Cybercrime is a huge topic these days. What exactly does this law cover?
It divides cybercrimes into three main groups. First, you have offenses that mess with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of computer data and systems. Think illegal access, data interference, and system interference.
So hacking, data breaches, anything that messes with computers or steals information.
Exactly. Then you have computer-related offenses. These are traditional crimes committed using computers.
So like online fraud, forgery, identity thefts.
Right. It's the same old crimes, but with a digital twist. And finally, you have content-related offenses. These involve making or sharing bad stuff online.
I'm guessing that includes things like cybersex, child pornography, spam, and that whole cyber libel thing.
You got it. Cyber libel is interesting because it's basically libel, but online. Making false statements that hurt someone's reputation, but it's all happening online.
So spreading nasty rumors on social media could be considered cyber libel.
Absolutely. And because it's online, it can spread so much faster and cause much more damage. Speaking of causing damage, let's talk about a specific type of cybercrime, cyber squatting.
Cyber squatting. That sounds made up. What is that?
It's a real thing. It's when someone registers the domain name that's very similar to an existing trademark or someone's name with the intent to either profit from it or just cause trouble.
So like if someone registered Amazon.com or Microsoft.com and tried to sell those domain names back to the real Amazon or Microsoft.
Exactly. Or they could use the domain to spread fake news or damage the company's image.
That's pretty sneaky. I can see why they would make that a crime. Okay, let's go from the digital world back to the real one and talk about a crime that seems pretty old school, but is still a problem: carnapping.
Carnapping in the Philippines is more than just your average car theft. The new Anti-Carnapping Act of 2016 lays it all out.
So is it basically the same thing as carjacking?
It's similar, but carnapping is a broader term. It includes taking a motor vehicle without the owner's consent, and that can involve violence or intimidation or even just using sneaky tactics.
So carjacking would be a type of carnapping, but carnapping also includes things like stealing a car from a parking lot or towing it away illegally.
Exactly. And they're pretty broad in what they consider a motor vehicle. We're talking cars, trucks, motorcycles, buses, even those little motorized tricycles you see everywhere. Basically anything with an engine that uses public roads.
Okay, so they're casting a wide net. And what about those involved in hiding a stolen car?
That's covered too. They have a specific provision for concealing carnapping. If you help someone hide a stolen car, you're in trouble.
So it's like being an accomplice to the crime.
Exactly. And the penalties can be pretty serious. Individuals face imprisonment. But if a company is involved, like a chop shop, they could lose their business license.
Wow, they're really trying to crack down on the whole
network involved in car theft. Okay, let's go back to the topic of protecting children. Remember the Special Protection of Children Against Abuse, Exploitation, and Discrimination Act, or RA 7610. We touched on that earlier.
Yeah, that one seemed to cover a really wide range of offenses.
It does. This law protects everyone under 18, as well as adults who can't take care of themselves because of a disability. It's all about recognizing that vulnerability can exist at any age.
Okay, so it goes beyond just protecting kids from sexual exploitation. How does this law define child abuse in general?
It's a pretty broad definition. It includes any act that harms a child's well-being. So we're talking physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, emotional maltreatment, neglect, pretty much anything that can hurt a child.
Wow, so they're really taking a holistic approach.
They are. And the law covers some very specific offenses too, like child prostitution and trafficking, exposing kids to obscene materials, and even employing children in dangerous conditions.
So it's about protecting kids from all sorts of exploitation and abuse.
Exactly. And there's this one part of the law that I find particularly interesting. It specifically outlaws the sweetheart defense in cases of child prostitution.
Sweetheart defense, what's that?
It's basically when the defendant tries to argue that the child willingly participated because they were in a romantic relationship.
So they're trying to say it wasn't exploitation because the child was supposedly in love with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the law shuts that down. It doesn't matter if the child supposedly consented. Children, by definition, can't give meaningful consent in these situations.
It's about acknowledging that power imbalance and putting the child's safety first, no matter what.
Absolutely. The law also tackles child labor. In general, employing kids under 15 is prohibited, but there's some very specific exceptions, like if the child is working in a family business or participating in entertainment, as long as there are safeguards in place to protect the child's well-being.
So a child helping out in their family store is okay, but working in a factory is not.
That's the general idea. And even when exceptions are made, the law sets strict rules to make sure the child is safe and their education isn't being compromised.
It's about recognizing the complexities of child labor while still prioritizing the child's best interests. Okay, let's move on to a crime that can really wreak havoc on communities: swindling by a syndicate.
Now, that's an interesting one. It might sound like something out of an old crime novel, but swindling by a syndicate is still a problem in the Philippines, and they have a law specifically to address it.
What exactly is swindling by a syndicate?
Well, it involves a group of 5 or more people who form a syndicate to defraud others.
So it's not just your average con artist. It's a whole organized group of criminals working together.
Exactly. And the law specifically targets those syndicates that prey on types of organizations like rural banks, cooperatives, farmers associations, places where people pool their resources.
So they're going after those who exploit the trust and vulnerability of these institutions.
Precisely. Okay, let's move on to a crime that's sadly still a reality in many parts of the world: arson.
Arson is a terrifying thought, but it always makes me wonder, how do they actually prove someone committed arson? It seems like all the evidence would go up in flames.
You're right, it can be tricky. But the law on arson, or Presidential Decree 1613, actually helps investigators by outlining what they consider prima facie evidence of arson.
Prima facie evidence, what does that mean?
It means evidence that's strong enough to create a presumption of guilt unless the defendant can come up with another explanation. It's evidence that really points to arson.
Okay, so what kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, for example, if investigators find multiple fires that started at the same time in different parts of a building, that's a pretty good indication that someone was setting things on fire on purpose.
That makes sense. It's not likely that multiple fires would start naturally in different spots all at once.
Exactly. Or if they discover unusual amounts of flammable materials or traces of accelerants, like gasoline, that's another red flag.
So it's like a puzzle where the investigators have to look for these clues to determine if the fire was accidental or deliberate.
Exactly. They're looking for anything out of the ordinary that might point to arson.
Okay, from burning buildings to a crime that can literally paralyze whole societies with fear terrorism, how does the Philippines address this in their legal system?
The Philippines has a law called the Anti-Terrorism Act, or RA 11179, and it's a pretty comprehensive law.
Okay, what's covered under this law?
Well, it obviously criminalizes terrorist acts themselves. But it goes beyond that. It tries to prevent terrorism by targeting those who fund these activities. And it also establishes a process for officially labeling individuals and organizations as terrorists.
So it's not just about reacting to attacks after they've happened, it's about stopping them before they even occur.
Exactly. But it's also important to understand how this law defines terrorism. It's not just any act of violence. It has to be intended to cause death or serious harm to civilians, and it has to be done with the goal of either intimidating the public or forcing a government or international organization to do something they don't want to do.
So it's not just about the act itself, it's about the intent behind it.
Precisely. And the Supreme Court weighed in on this in a case called Crimlaw v. Executive Secretary. They made it clear that proving the intent to harm civilians is absolutely essential when it comes to terrorism charges.
So it's a high bar to meet, which is good. It protects people from being wrongly accused.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to the specific acts that qualify as terrorism under this law, the list is pretty extensive. It includes causing death or serious injury, damaging property on a massive scale, disrupting critical infrastructure, developing weapons of mass destruction, releasing dangerous substances, and even causing things like fires, floods, or explosions.
So they're covering all the bases,
Mhm.
from traditional attacks to more modern forms of terrorism?
They are. They recognize that terrorism can take many forms, and they are trying to stay ahead of the curve. Now, there's one part of this law that's been particularly controversial, the process of designating and prescribing terrorist individuals and organizations.
Yeah, I've heard about that. It seems like a very delicate process. How does it actually work?
Well, it involves two key players, the Anti-Terrorism Council, or ATC, and the Court of Appeals. The ATC starts by automatically adopting the list of designated terrorists put out by the UN Security Council. But they can also add individuals or groups to that list based on their own investigations.
So they're using both international and domestic intelligence.
Right. And if they want to officially ban an organization that's called prescription that goes through the Court of Appeals.
So there's a judicial process involved, with checks and balances to make sure it's not abused.
Exactly. The Department of Justice can file a petition for prescription, but they need the ATC's approval, and the organization in question have the right to defend themselves in court.
Okay, so it's not just a matter of the government saying this group is bad. They have to go through a legal process and provide evidence?
Exactly. Due process is still essential, even in terrorism cases. Now, one part of this law that sparked a lot of debate is the provision for detention without a judicial warrant.
Yeah, that one's definitely raised some eyebrows. How does that work?
Well, the law says that law enforcement or military personnel can detain a suspect for up to 14 days without a warrant, but only if they have written authorization from the ATC.
14 days without charges. That's a pretty long time.
It is, and this provision has been criticized by some who worry that it could be abused and lead to people being detained arbitrarily.
Are there any safeguards in place to prevent that?
There are some. The law requires officers to notify a judge about the detention within 3 days, and they have to provide details about the arrest, the suspect's location, and their physical and mental state. The ATC and the Commission on Human Rights also have to be notified.
So it's not a completely secret detention. There's at least some oversight.
Right, but it's still a very controversial aspect of the law.
Now, can this detention period be extended beyond those initial 14 days?
It can, but only under specific circumstances. They can extend it for up to 10 more days.
Okay, and what are those circumstances?
They have to show that further detention is absolutely necessary, maybe to preserve evidence or to prevent another attack from happening, but they also have to show that the investigation is moving forward and there are no unnecessary delays.
So it's not just a matter of keeping someone locked up for longer. They have to have very specific reasons.
Exactly. This whole issue of detention without a warrant is definitely one of the most debated aspects of the Anti-Terrorism Act.
It's a complex issue, for sure. Okay, we've delved into the Anti-Terrorism Act, but there's another law that zeroes in on the financial side of this, the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act, or RA 10168.
This law aims to disrupt the funding streams of terrorist groups. Pure and simple.
That makes sense. Money is the lifeblood of any organization, so cutting off their financing seems like a pretty effective strategy.
It is, and this law is broad in how it defines the financing of terrorism. It's not just about giving money directly to a terrorist group. It's about any action that helps them get the resources they need.
So even things like providing property or financial services or even directing others to engage in terrorism financing, it's all covered.
You got it. They're not just going after the big-time financiers. They're also targeting those who facilitate these transactions and those who organize or direct others to participate. It's about dismantling the entire financial network that supports these groups.
Wow, they're really covering all the angles.
They are. And they're not just waiting until a crime's been committed. They're also targeting attempts and conspiracies to finance terrorism.
It's like they're saying, we're not just going to sit back and wait for an attack to happen. We're going to be proactive about disrupting these networks.
Exactly. And one of the interesting things about this law is this concept of predicate offenses.
Predicate offenses, what are those?
These are crimes that can be linked to terrorism financing. So say someone's convicted of drug trafficking, and then they discover that the profits were going to fund a terrorist group. Now, that person can also be hit with a terrorism financing charge.
Oh, so it's like connecting the dots between seemingly unrelated crimes to expose a larger web of terrorist activity.
That's exactly it. It recognizes that criminal networks can overlap and support each other in unexpected ways.
That's fascinating. Any other interesting details about this law?
It also has what's called extraterritorial application, which means it can apply to certain offenses committed by Filipinos even when they're outside the Philippines.
So, if a Filipino citizen is involved in terrorism financing in another country, they could still face charges back home.
That's right. It underscores the fact that terrorism is a global problem that requires international cooperation to address effectively.
Wow. The Philippines is really taking a strong stance against terrorism. Okay, let's step away from that intense topic and explore something that might seem more old-fashioned, but is still a serious issue: piracy.
Piracy might sound like something out of a history book, but it's actually still a real problem in some parts of the world, and the Philippines has a law specifically to address it, Presidential Decree 532, also known as the Anti-Piracy and Anti-Highway Robbery Law.
So are we talking about pirates with eye patches and parrots sailing the high seas?
Well, maybe not quite like that, but the law does cover any attack or seizure of a vessel in Philippine waters using violence, intimidation, or force.
So it could involve anything from a small boat with armed robbers to a larger, more organized operation.
Exactly. And the law defines Philippine waters pretty broadly. We're talking about all the waters surrounding and connecting the islands, including the territorial sea, the seabed, and any other areas where the Philippines has jurisdiction.
Okay, so they're protecting their entire maritime territory.
Absolutely. They are serious about safeguarding their waters from piracy. And the penalties for piracy are nothing to sneeze at. We're talking reclusion temporal, which means a fixed-term prison sentence of up to 20 years. Or even reclusion perpetua, which is life imprisonment.
Wow, that's serious time.
It is. And if other crimes are committed during the act of piracy, the penalties get even harsher. Like, if anyone is injured during the attack, the pirates face a longer sentence. And if there's rape, murder, or if the victims are abandoned at sea, the penalty is death.
Okay, that's about as serious as it gets. They're definitely not messing around with pirates. What about highway robbery? How does the law define that?
Highway robbery, also known as brigandage, is basically piracy, but on land. It involves seizing someone for ransom or taking their property on a highway, using violence, intimidation, or force.
So it's about protecting people and goods traveling on the roads. What are the penalties like for highway robbery?
They're still harsh, but not quite as severe as those for piracy. The base penalty is reclusion temporal, starting at 12 years.
That's still a long time behind bars.
It is. And like piracy, if other crimes happen during the robbery, the sentences get longer. And if it involves kidnapping, murder, or rape, the penalty is death.
Wow. The Philippines is definitely tough on violent crimes.
They are. And that commitment to protecting people also extends to a very sensitive issue: statutory rape.
Statutory rape is definitely a complex and sensitive topic. What's the Philippine law on this?
Well, the law, which is called an act providing for stronger protection against rape and sexual exploitation and abuse, increasing the age for determining the commission of statutory rape, actually changed things significantly.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did they change?
First of all, they raised the age of consent from 12 to 16, which is a huge step forward in protecting young people.
That's fantastic. That aligns much better with international standards.
It does. But they also added an exception that's generated a lot of discussion.
An exception? What's that?
The law says that there's no criminal liability for sexual acts between people over 16, even if one of them is younger, as long as the age difference is no more than 3 years. But there's a catch: they have to prove it was consensual, non-abusive, and non-exploitative.
So a 19-year-old and a 16-year-old could legally have sex under this exception?
Yes, if it truly meets all those conditions. But there's one very important thing to remember. This exception does not apply if the victim is under 13. Any sexual activity with a child under 13 is always considered statutory rape, no matter what.
Okay, so they're drawing a very firm line at 13, which makes sense.
Absolutely. It seems like they are trying to find a balance between acknowledging that teenagers do engage in romantic relationships and protecting young people from exploitation.
It's definitely a complex issue. Okay, speaking of protecting young people, what about those who end up on the other side of the law? What does the Philippines juvenile justice system look like?
They have a specific law for that: the Juvenile Justice and Welfare Act, also known as RA 9344. And their approach is pretty unique.
What makes it so unique?
It's really focused on rehabilitation and reintegration. They recognize that kids are different from adults, and that when a child breaks the law, it often stems from different circumstances. So their system emphasizes helping these kids get back on track, not just punishing them.
That's a much more humane and, frankly, effective approach.
It is. One of the key things about this law is the idea of diversion.
Diversion, what does that mean?
It means trying to resolve cases outside of the formal court system whenever possible. Like if it's a minor offense and the child admits they did wrong, they might use things like mediation or family conferences to address the harm that was done and help the child make amends.
That sounds so much less traumatic for a child and potentially more effective in the long run.
Exactly. It's about finding solutions that benefit everyone involved.
Okay, are there any other key aspects of this system that stand out?
Another big one is the automatic suspension of sentence for children who are found guilty of offenses.
Automatic suspension. So even if a kid is convicted, they don't automatically go to jail.
Right. Instead, they are placed under supervision, and the court decides what kind of rehabilitation or intervention program is the best fit.
So it's like giving them a chance to prove they can do better.
Exactly. It's based on the idea that children are still developing and that their actions might not reflect their true character or their potential for change. But there are exceptions to this automatic suspension.
So it's not a free pass. What kind of situations would lead to a child actually serving time?
Well, if a child has already had a sentence suspended in the past, the court might decide that a stricter approach is necessary.
So they have to show they're serious about changing their behavior.
Right. And the law also makes sure to protect children who are victims or witnesses in cases.
Oh, that's so important. Children are particularly vulnerable in those situations. What kind of protections are there?
They can use things like videotape testimonies or closed-circuit television so the child doesn't have to directly face their abuser in court.
Wow, that's great. It minimizes the trauma while still allowing their testimony to be heard.
Exactly. It's about creating a system that recognizes the special needs of children.
This whole Juvenile Justice and Welfare Act is truly remarkable. It seems like the Philippines is way ahead of many other countries in terms of their approach to juvenile justice.
They are. It's a great example of how the law can be used not just to punish, but also to guide young people towards a better path. Now, before we move on, let's touch on a couple more specific offenses that are interesting from a legal perspective. Obstruction of justice and the refusal of hospitals to provide emergency treatment.
Obstruction of justice sounds like something you'd see on a legal drama. What does that actually mean in the Philippines?
Presidential Decree 1829 spells it out. Basically, it covers anything that interferes with the apprehension of suspects or the investigation and prosecution of criminal cases.
So any action that hinders the legal process and prevents justice from being served.
Exactly. Things like hiding a suspect, providing false information to the authorities, intimidating witnesses, destroying evidence, even offering bribes or threats to officials to derail a case. Those are all examples of obstruction of justice.
They've really covered all the bases.
They have. And the penalties for this can be quite severe. Now, the refusal of hospitals to provide emergency treatment, this is a really important one.
It's a scary thought. I can't imagine being denied emergency care.
It's a fundamental right to receive emergency medical treatment, and the Philippines has a law that addresses this directly, BATAS PAMBANSA 702, as amended by Republic Act 8344. Basically, it makes it illegal for hospitals and clinics to refuse to give initial treatment in emergency cases.
So no matter what, they have to provide emergency care.
That's the goal. The law focuses on situations where someone's life or long-term health is in imminent danger and they need immediate medical attention.
Okay, but to actually prosecute a hospital under this law, what does the prosecution need to prove?
They need to demonstrate that it was a true emergency. They have to identify who at the hospital was responsible for refusing treatment, and they need to prove that they either asked for a deposit or payment before giving treatment or that they just flat out refused to give the necessary care.
So it's about preventing hospitals from prioritizing money over a patient's well-being.
Exactly. They want to ensure that everyone has access to emergency care when they need it the most. Now, the law does take into account that sometimes a hospital might not have the right equipment or specialists to handle a particular emergency.
That makes sense. So what happens in those cases?
The law allows for patient transfers to other facilities. But if the patient is conscious and able to understand what's happening, they have to give consent.
That seems fair. What if the patient is unconscious or too sick to agree to a transfer?
In those situations, a doctor can transfer the patient without their consent, but only after stabilizing them and making sure the transfer itself won't put the patient in more danger.
So they can't just ship them off to another hospital without first making sure it's safe.
Exactly. And importantly, the hospital that receives the transferred patient can't refuse to take them or demand payment before they provide the necessary care.
So the patient's well-being is always a priority, even if they can't advocate for themselves?
Precisely. It's all about upholding the ethical responsibility of medical professionals to prioritize their patients' lives.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's delve into one of the most sensitive and frankly disturbing areas of law, crimes against international humanitarian law, genocide, and other crimes against humanity.
These are the most serious crimes imaginable, and the Philippines has a specific law to deal with them. Republic Act 9851, also known as the Philippine Act on Crimes Against International Humanitarian Law, Genocide, and Other Crimes Against Humanity.
Wow, that's a mouthful. Why does the Philippines even have a law for these types of crimes? It seems like they're usually dealt with by international courts.
Well, the Philippines wants to make sure it has the power to prosecute individuals for these crimes, even if they're committed outside of the Philippines. It's about upholding international law and making sure that perpetrators don't escape justice.
So they're not just focusing on crimes within their borders, they're taking a global stance on justice.
Right. And this law specifically covers war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity.
Those are some heavy terms. Can you give us some examples of what those actually mean in practice?
Sure. War crimes include things like killing or torturing civilians or prisoners of war, taking hostages, using child soldiers, and attacking hospitals or other places that are supposed to be protected during wartime.
So it's about making sure the rules of war are followed, even in the chaos of conflict.
Exactly. And then you have genocide, which is the deliberate and systematic attempt to destroy an entire national, ethnic, racial, or religious group.
That's one of the most horrific crimes imaginable.
It is. And crimes against humanity are those awful acts committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. We're talking murder, enslavement, torture, rape, deportation, and a whole host of other inhumane acts.
So it's not just about individual acts of violence, it's about a pattern of persecution or oppression targeting a specific group of people.
Right. And the law also specifically addresses a crime called enforced disappearance.
Enforced disappearance? That sounds terrifying.
It is. It's when someone is secretly arrested, detained, or abducted, usually by the government or people working for the government, and then their whereabouts are hidden and their fate is unknown.
It's like they just vanish off the face of the earth.
Exactly. It's a truly terrible crime that violates basic human rights. Now, this law doesn't just focus on individual perpetrators. It also considers the responsibility of those in charge when their subordinates commit these kinds of crimes.
So if a soldier commits a war crime, could their commanding officer also be held responsible?
Yes, but only under very specific conditions. The law says that a superior can be held liable if they knew, or should have known, that their subordinate was about to commit or was committing a crime, and they didn't take any steps to stop it or punish the offender.
So it's about accountability at all levels.
Right. But what about if a subordinate was just following orders? Can that be used as a defense?
That's a tricky one.
It is. The law says that following orders from a superior can sometimes be a defense, but not if the order itself was clearly illegal.
So blind obedience is not an excuse if you're being told to do something that's clearly wrong.
Exactly. And here's another interesting thing. The Philippines says they have the right to prosecute war crimes, even if those crimes happen outside of the Philippines. But there are conditions. Either the person who committed the crime or the victim has to be Filipino.
So they're really serious about holding people accountable for these crimes, even if they occur elsewhere.
They are. They want to send a clear message that these crimes are unacceptable no matter where they happen.
This has been a really heavy but incredibly informative look at the Philippines' efforts to address these most horrific crimes.
It's a sobering reminder that these things are still happening in the world, but it's also encouraging to see a country taking such a strong stance against them. Okay, let's move on to a lighter subject. Something most of us have probably experienced at some point, bouncing checks.
Oh, I've been there. That sinking feeling when you realize your check's not going to clear, it's the worst. But seriously, is that actually a crime in the Philippines?
It is. They have a specific law, BATAS PAMBANSA BILANG 22, which everyone just calls the bouncing checks law, that deals with this.
So what exactly does this law cover?
It focuses on checks used for transactions, like paying for goods or services, not personal checks or money orders.
So if I write a check at the grocery store and it bounces, am I going to jail?
Probably not. The law really targets two main scenarios. The first is when someone knowingly writes a check when they know they don't have enough money in their account to cover it.
Okay, so that's intentional, like they're trying to get away with something.
Exactly. That's considered a crime. The second scenario is a little different. It's when someone has enough money in their account when they write the check, but then they don't keep enough money in there and the check bounces within 90 days.
So even if it wasn't deliberate, you can still get in trouble for basically mismanaging your account and causing a check to bounce.
Right. It's about being responsible with your finances and making sure you can cover the checks you write.
Okay, that makes sense. Are there any other quirks about this law?
One interesting thing is that stolen checks actually don't fall under this law
Wait, really? Why not?
because they're considered to have been issued without something called valuable consideration. Basically, there wasn't a genuine exchange of goods or services behind that check.
So if someone steals my checkbook and writes a bad check to themselves, it's a different crime, but not a violation of the bouncing checks law.
Exactly. They might be in trouble for theft or forgery, but not specifically for violating the bouncing checks law.
That's interesting. Okay, what else should we know about bouncing checks in the Philippines?
One more thing, the law talks about something called written notice of dishonor. It basically means that the person who got the bounce check has to formally notify the check writer in writing that their check bounced
And why is that written notice so important?
because it triggers a 5-day grace period. The check writer has 5 days to either pay the full amount or work something out with the person they wrote the check to before they face criminal charges.
Oh, so it's like a second chance to make things right.
Exactly. It gives the check writer a chance to fix the situation before things escalate.
That makes sense. Are there any real-world examples of how this works?
There are. There's a case called Deco v. CA, where the conviction was actually reversed because the prosecution couldn't prove the check writer received proper written notice. And in another case, Risterio v. People, really made it clear that the notice needs to be received within 90 days for the whole presumption of knowledge of insufficient funds to apply.
So it's not just about sending the notice, it's about proving it was received on time. Okay, that's a lot to keep in mind. From bounce checks to a topic that's been generating a lot of headlines, let's talk about the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002.
Ah, yes, RA 9165. This law has definitely been the subject of a lot of debate. It covers a huge range of drug offenses, from importation to possession.
Okay, so it's really trying to address the drug problem in the Philippines from every angle.
It is, but it's also very broad in its scope.
Okay, what are some specific things people can get in trouble for under this law?
Well, importing, selling, trading, transporting, making drugs, those are all obvious ones. But it goes further than that. Maintaining a drug den, using drugs, even just growing plants that are classified as dangerous drugs, all of that is illegal under this law.
So they're not just going after the big-time drug lords, they're also targeting users and small-time dealers.
Right. They're trying to disrupt the entire drug trade from top to bottom. And this is where some of the controversy comes in, particularly with something called the chain of custody rule.
Chain of custody, what's that all about?
Basically, it means carefully documenting every single step of how drug evidence is handled from the moment it's seized all the way to when it's presented in court, like a paper trail proving it wasn't tampered with or planted.
So every single hand that touches the evidence has to be recorded.
Pretty much. And if there's any break in that chain of custody, the case can be thrown out, even if there's other evidence of guilt. The courts take this very seriously.
Wow. So even a tiny error in handling evidence could let someone go free.
It has happened. There's a famous case, Shikinshi v. People, where the Supreme Court acquitted the accused because there were problems with the chain of custody.
So
It really highlights how important it is to handle evidence properly. But the courts also acknowledge that sometimes minor errors happen, especially if there's a good reason for them, and they don't affect the evidence's integrity.
So it's about striking a balance, making sure the process is fair, but also holding those in the drug trade accountable.
Okay, so we've talked about the chain of custody, but what about actually proving that the substance is a drug in the first place?
That's another important legal concept called corpus delicti.
Corpus delicti.
Yeah.
Sounds intense.
It means body of the crime. Essentially, you have to prove the substance seized is actually a prohibited drug. You can't just say, oh, we found this white powder, it must be illegal. You need proof.
So they have to test it and show that it's actually cocaine or heroin or whatever illegal drug they're alleging.
Exactly. Scientific evidence is key. Usually that means a laboratory analysis to identify the substance and its purity.
Okay, so there's a lot of science involved in these cases.
Absolutely. It's about making sure they're convicting people based on solid evidence, not just assumptions. Okay, enough about the physical world. Let's talk about cybercrime. The Philippines has a law called the Cybercrime Prevention Act of 2012, which specifically deals with online offenses.
Cybercrime is a huge topic. What exactly does this law cover? It breaks cybercrimes down into three main categories. First, there are offenses against the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of computer data and systems. We're talking about legal access, data interference, system interference, basically, anything that messes with computers or the information they hold.
So, hacking, data breaches, and things like that.
You got it. Next, you have computer-related offenses. These are basically traditional crimes, but they're committed using computers.
So, like online fraud, identity theft, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's the same old crimes, but with a digital twist. And finally, you have content-related offenses. These are crimes that involve the creation or distribution of harmful or illegal content online.
Okay, so I'm guessing that covers things like cybersex, child pornography, online harassment, and all that.
Absolutely. And one type of content-related offense that's particularly interesting is cyber libel.
Cyber libel. So that's like regular libel, but online.
Right. It's about making false statements that damage someone's reputation. But instead of happening in print or on TV, it happens online.
So spreading rumors on social media could get you in trouble for cyber libel.
It could, especially if those rumors are false and cause real harm to someone's reputation. And because the internet is so vast and information spreads so quickly, cyber libel can be even more damaging than traditional libel.
That makes sense. It's so much harder to control the spread of information online. Are there any other specific types of cybercrime covered by this law that are particularly interesting or concerning?
One that stands out is cyber squatting.
Cyber squatting, what's that?
It's basically when someone registers a domain name that's almost identical to an existing trademark or someone's name with the intention of either profiting from it or causing harm to the rightful owner.
So like if someone registered facebook.com or google.com and then tried to sell it back to the real Facebook or Google.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or they could use that domain to spread fake news or damage the company's reputation.
Wow, that's pretty sneaky. Okay, from cyberspace back to the real world, let's talk about a crime that's unfortunately still quite common, carnapping.
Carnapping in the Philippines is a little different from your typical car theft. The new Anti-Carnapping Act of 2016 lays it all out.
So what's the difference between carnapping and, say, carjacking?
Carjacking is a form of carnapping, but carnapping is a broader term. It basically means taking a motor vehicle without the owner's consent, using violence, intimidation, or even sneaky tactics.
So carjacking would be a type of carnapping, but carnapping would also cover things like stealing a car from a parking lot or having it towed away illegally.
Exactly. And when they say motor vehicle, they mean it. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, buses, those little motorized tricycles, basically anything with an engine that uses public roads, with a few exceptions, like tractors used exclusively for farming.
So they're pretty much covering all the bases. And what about people who help hide a stolen car?
That's covered too. The law has a specific provision for concealing carnapping. If you help someone hide a stolen vehicle, you're in just as much trouble as the person who actually stole it.
Okay, so they're cracking down on the whole network involved in car theft. What kind of penalties are we talking about here?
They can be pretty steep. Individuals can face years in prison. And if a company's involved, like a chop shop that's dismantling stolen vehicles, they could lose their license. And the people in charge could even face personal charges.
Wow, they're serious about putting a stop to carnapping.
Okay, let's shift back to a topic we've touched on before: protecting children. Remember the Special Protection of Children Against Abuse, Exploitation, and Discrimination Act, or RA 7610.
This law is all about protecting children from all sorts of harm.
We talked about online and offline child sexual abuse before, but this law seems to go even further.
It does. It protects all children under 18 years old, as well as adults who can't fully take care of themselves because of a disability. It recognizes that vulnerability can come in different forms.
That's really important. And how does this law define child abuse?
It's a pretty broad definition. Any act that could harm a child's well-being, whether it's physical, psychological, sexual, emotional abuse, or even neglect. So they're not just focusing on one specific type of abuse, they're trying to address all the ways a child can be harmed. What about specific offenses covered by this law?
Well, it covers a lot. Child prostitution, trafficking, forcing children to work in dangerous conditions, exposing them to pornography or other harmful materials. It's all in there.
So it's about protecting children from all forms of exploitation and ensuring their safety and well-being.
Exactly. And there's this one part of the law that I find particularly interesting. It specifically outlaws something called the sweetheart defense in cases of child prostitution.
The sweetheart defense, I've never heard of that.
It's a tactic sometimes used in these types of cases where the defendant tries to claim that the child willingly participated in the sexual activity because they were supposedly in a romantic relationship.
So they try to minimize the abuse by claiming it was a love affair.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the law recognizes that children cannot truly consent to sexual activity with adults, so this defense is never allowed.
That's good to know. They're taking a firm stance on protecting children no matter what.
They are. And the law also addresses child labor, which is a big issue in many parts of the world. Generally, it's illegal to employ kids under 15 years old.
So no kids working in factories or on farms.
Right. But there are some limited exceptions, like if the child is working in a family business or involved in the entertainment industry, as long as there are rules in place to protect the child's safety and well-being.
It's about finding a balance, acknowledging that there are situations where children can work, but making sure it's done safely and ethically.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears again, let's talk about a crime that can really devastate communities: swindling by a syndicate.
Swindling by a syndicate? That sounds like something out of an old detective movie.
You'd be surprised how often it still happens. This law specifically targets organized groups of 5 or more people who band together to scam others.
So we're not just talking about a lone con artist. It's a whole team of criminals working together.
Right. And this law focuses on those syndicates that target specific types of organizations like rural banks, cooperatives, farmers associations, and other groups that handle public funds.
So they're going after those who prey on institutions that are vital to local economies.
Exactly. These types of scams can really cripple communities. Okay, let's move on to a crime that, sadly, is a reality all over the world: arson. I always wondered how investigators actually prove that someone committed arson. It seems like the evidence would literally go up in smoke. You're right, it can be tough.
Oh.
But the Philippines has a law, Presidential Decree 1613, also known as the Law on Arson, that helps investigators by outlining what they call prima facie evidence of arson.
Prima facie evidence. What does that mean?
It's evidence that, on its face, is strong enough to create a presumption of guilt, unless the defendant can come up with another more convincing explanation. It's evidence that really points to arson.
Okay, so what kind of evidence are we talking about?
For example, if investigators find multiple fires that all started at the same time in different parts of a building, that's a pretty strong indicator that someone was deliberately setting things on fire. Or if they find unusual amounts of flammable liquids or traces of things like gasoline, that's a red flag.
So it's like they're piecing together a puzzle, looking for clues that don't add up.
Exactly. They're looking for anything that suggests the fire wasn't an accident. Okay, from burning buildings to something that can create a climate of fear across entire nations' terrorism. The Philippines has a specific law, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2012, to address this very real threat.
Terrorism is such a complex issue. How does this law approach it?
This law aims to prevent and suppress terrorist acts, but it also goes beyond that. It tackles the issue of financing terrorism and outlines a process for officially designating individuals and groups as terrorists.
So it's a multi-pronged approach. It's not just about responding to attacks, it's about stopping them from happening in the first place.
Exactly. But to understand this law, we need to start with its definition of terrorism.
Yeah.
And it's very specific. It's any act intended to cause death or serious injury to civilians or non-combatants, designed to scare the public or force a government or international organization to do something.
So it's not just any act of violence. It has to be specifically designed to spread fear and influence decision-making.
Right. And in a case called Kaleja v. Executive Secretary, the Supreme Court actually highlighted the importance of proving intent when it comes to terrorism charges.
So you can't just accuse someone of terrorism without proving they intended to cause fear and disrupt society.
Exactly. Now, the law itself lists a variety of acts that can be considered terrorism. Things like causing death or injury on a large scale, damaging property extensively, messing with important infrastructure, developing weapons of mass destruction, releasing dangerous substances, and even triggering things like fires, floods, or explosions.
So they're covering everything from traditional bombings to more modern forms of terrorism like cyber attacks.
They're trying to be as comprehensive as possible, recognizing that terrorism can take many forms. Now, one part of this law that's been very controversial is the process of designating and proscribing terrorist individuals and organizations.
Yeah, that's the part that's been in the news a lot. It seems like a pretty sensitive area. How does it actually work?
It involves two main players, the Anti-Terrorism Council, or ATC, and the Court of Appeals. The ATC starts by adopting the list of designated terrorists put out by the UN Security Council.
So they're using international intelligence.
Yes, but they can also add individuals or groups to that list based on their own investigations and findings.
Okay, so they're not just relying on international sources, they're also doing their own research.
Exactly. And if they want to officially ban an organization, it's called proscription that goes through the Court of Appeals.
So there's a legal process involved to make sure it's not abused.
Right. The Department of Justice can file a petition for proscription, but they need the ATC's approval, and the organization being targeted has the right to defend themselves in court.
Okay, so there's some level of due process.
Absolutely. Now, there's one part of this law that's generated a lot of debate and criticism. The provision for detention without a judicial warrant.
Yeah, that one definitely sounds concerning. How does that work?
The law allows law enforcement or military personnel to detain a suspect for up to 14 days without a warrant if they have written authorization from the ATC.
14 days without being charged with a crime. That's a long time.
It is. And this provision has been criticized by human rights groups who are concerned about the potential for abuse.
I can see why they're worried. Are there any safeguards in place to make sure this power isn't abused?
Well, the law does require the officers to notify a judge in writing about the detention within 3 days. They have to provide details about the arrest, the suspect's location, and their physical and mental condition. The ATC and the Commission on Human Rights must also be notified.
So it's not a completely secret detention.
Right. But critics argue that those safeguards aren't enough to prevent abuse.
Now, is it possible to extend that detention period beyond 14 days?
Yes. In certain situations, it can be extended for up to another 10 days.
Okay, so what are those situations?
They have to demonstrate that keeping the person in custody for longer is absolutely necessary to protect evidence, prevent another attack, and they have to show that the investigation is proceeding without unnecessary delays.
So it's not just a rubber stamp. They have to justify the extension.
Exactly. Now, as we've discussed, this provision for detention without a warrant is definitely a hot-button issue, and it sparked a lot of debate about the balance between security and individual rights.
It's a tough balance to strike, for sure. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground with the Anti-Terrorism Act, but let's not forget about the law that specifically addresses the funding of these activities, the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act, or RA 1168.
This law is all about cutting off the financial lifelines of terrorist groups.
That makes sense. Money is the lifeblood of any organization. If you can disrupt their funding, you can disrupt their activities.
Exactly. And this law is very broad in how it defines financing of terrorism. It's not just about giving money directly to a terrorist group. It's about anything you do that helps them get the resources they need to carry out attacks.
So things like providing property or funds, making financial services available to them, even just directing others to engage in terrorism financing, it's all illegal.
You got it. And they're not just going after the big-time financiers. They're also targeting those who play a smaller role in moving money around, or those who organize and direct others to participate in these schemes.
So they're going after the entire network.
Absolutely. They're trying to dismantle the whole financial infrastructure that supports these groups.
Yeah.
And they're not waiting until the money has actually been used for a terrorist act. They're also targeting attempts and conspiracies to finance terrorism.
It's like they're saying, we're not going to wait for you to actually carry out an attack. We're going to stop you at the funding stage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about this law is the concept of predicate offenses.
Predicate offenses, what are those?
Basically, these are other crimes that can be used as the basis for a terrorism financing charge. So let's say someone is convicted of drug trafficking, and then it's discovered that the profits from those drug sales were intended to fund a terrorist group. Now, that person can be charged with financing of terrorism in addition to the drug trafficking charge.
So it's about connecting the dots between seemingly unrelated crimes and revealing the bigger picture of how these networks operate.
Precisely. It shows how different criminal activities can overlap and reinforce each other.
That's fascinating. Are there any other interesting features of this law that stand out?
Well, it also has what's called extraterritorial application. This means that it can be used to prosecute certain crimes committed by Filipino citizens even if those crimes happen outside the Philippines.
Wow. So even if a Filipino citizen is involved in financing terrorism in another country, they could still face charges back home.
Exactly. It really highlights the fact that terrorism is a global issue, and it requires international cooperation if we're going to effectively combat it.
This has been a really eye-opening look at how the Philippines is tackling the issue of terrorism from both a legal and a financial standpoint.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, but the Philippines is clearly committed to addressing it from every angle.
Well, this has been an incredible journey through the Philippine legal landscape. We've covered so much ground, from those unique crimes like cattle rustling and fencing to the really serious stuff like terrorism and human trafficking.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
I've learned so much about how Philippine law deals with these issues, and it's clear that they've put a lot of thought into creating laws that reflect their values and priorities. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
Never waste my